short, so would he. He was his movies. Chasing that feeling was intense and agonizing, not only for Walt, but also for everyone around him. Since Walt couldn't draw each cell himself, he had to let go of absolute control, but he couldn't bring himself to trust the world-class staff he had so carefully handpicked. Even after animation began, Walt screen-tested more than 150 young women for the role of Snow White, a marathon timesuck of exhausting comparison. When it came time to paint, Walt had the studio grind its own pigments, then painstakingly measured each with a spectrometer, one of only 20 in the world at the time, creating an expansive library of 1,200 different colors that pointlessly exceeded Technicolor's existing technology. Undaunted, Walt had the staff create a 7-foot-tall chart displaying exactly how each pigment would translate to the screen. Even in the final combustible days leading up to the movie's release, Walt couldn't stop micromanaging. "Have the hummingbird make 4 pickups instead of 6, he corrected. Regarding one of the dwarfs, his fanny in the last half of the scene is too high. The queen's eyebrows were too extreme. One of Grumpy's fingers was too big. In an irony visible only to his exasperated staff, Walt worried aloud that the constant revisions would suck the spontaneity from the film. Far from Walt's office, on the studio floor, the supervising director threw drawing boards across the room, screaming, "We gotta get the picture out!" When the film was finalized, Walt could only see the flaws. To a reporter, he admitted, "I've seen so much of Snow White that I am conscious only of the places where it could be improved. You see, we've learned such a lot since we started this thing. I wish I could yank it back and do it all over again." Ultimately, the colossal success of Snow White publicly cemented Walt's place in cinematic history. For a time, it was the highest-grossing American film ever, making nearly $92 million in today's dollars during its initial release. Away from the spotlight, however, it solidified Walt's perpetual dissatisfaction. His triumph only set the bar higher for Disney magic. Despite Walt's carefully crafted public image of the sheepish, aw shucks Uncle Walt, a journalist visiting the studios noted that Walt appeared to be under the lash of some private demon. After the war, faced with the realities of budgets and bank loans, the studio went through a round of layoffs and budget cuts. Walt, demoralized, began to lose his drive. His future films, he fretted, would never be the jewel box masterpieces, painstaking, gorgeous, almost spiritual experiences that the earlier ones had been. Rather than making the most of what he had or looking at the new constraints as a challenge to be mastered, he grew despondent. If the films couldn't be perfect, what was the point in making them? Walt tried immersing himself in an old interest, model trains. "Just a hobby to get my mind off my problems," he said. But he felt trapped and rule-bound even in leisure. Tellingly, Walt wrote to a fellow railroad buff who had constructed a model railroad big enough to straddle and ride in his yard, "I envy you for having the courage to do what you want." Caught between the false choice of perfection or failure, paralyzed by both his self-imposed standards and bank-imposed budget, Walt withdrew into himself. The Disney brand might have been centered on happiness and community, but Walt increasingly found himself lonely and isolated, mostly through his own making. When presented with a formal dinner invitation, he would RSVP "No" in red crayon, underlined for emphasis. Amid the frenetic activity at the studio, Walt would slouch in his chair and complain, "It gets lonely around here. I just want to talk to somebody." When lent a listening ear, however, he would ruminate aloud about his childhood hardships, and when it was his conversation partner's turn to talk, he would leave them hanging. "Gotta get going." The world Walt Disney had created, one of fantasy, innocence, and wish-upon-a-star fulfillment of dreams, stood in stark contrast to the world he lived in, where it was too precarious to loosen his grip, enjoy a genuine interest, or be a friend instead of a taskmaster. A New York Times reporter who visited the studios noted, "I came away feeling sad to find that the brilliant man..."